Israel does not operate in isolation. And what most people fail to understand is that modern geopolitical conflicts are rarely spontaneous. They are built, layered, and carefully escalated over time until the final moment appears inevitable rather than engineered. What we are witnessing right now is not a sudden shift toward Turkey, but the continuation of a long-standing strategic rhythm that only becomes visible when you step back and observe the sequence as a whole instead of focusing on individual events. The real mistake analysts make is treating each conflict as separate, disconnected incidents, when in reality they are chapters of the same evolving doctrine. And once you recognize that doctrine, the direction becomes uncomfortably clear. The foundation of this pattern begins with a simple but powerful necessity: sustained relevance through sustained tension. A state that is deeply integrated into global security frameworks, heavily reliant on external military and economic backing, cannot afford a vacuum of threat perception, because the moment the perception disappears, the justification weakens. And when justification weakens, support begins to erode quietly at first, then suddenly. This is not about ideology, it is about structure. Structures require maintenance, and in geopolitics, maintenance often comes in the form of controlled instability. If you trace the timeline carefully, you begin to notice that each previous adversary followed a similar arc. First came the language shift, subtle at the beginning, where statements evolve from criticism into categorization. A country is no longer just a rival or competitor, it becomes a risk, then a threat, and eventually an existential concern. That linguistic transition is never accidental. It is the earliest signal that a new focus is being constructed. And once that framing enters political speeches, media cycles, and policy discussions simultaneously, it starts embedding itself into public consciousness. Now look at the current situation. The rhetoric surrounding Turkey has begun to change in ways that mirror those early stages. It is no longer limited to disagreements over policy or regional influence. Instead, the framing is gradually shifting toward long-term incompatibility, and that distinction matters because disagreements can be negotiated, but incompatibility implies inevitability. That is where the trajectory starts to harden. But language alone is never enough. The second layer is amplification. Think tanks, analysts, and policy advisors begin producing a steady stream of reports that reinforce the emerging narrative. These reports are not designed to convince immediately, they are designed to normalize the idea over time. Repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity reduces resistance. When people hear the same conclusion from multiple independent sources, it begins to feel like consensus, even if it originated from a coordinated direction. What is happening now follows that exact rhythm. Discussions around Turkey's regional ambitions, its political direction, and its alliances are being reframed in a way that aligns with long-term threat construction. The key detail here is consistency. When multiple institutions begin echoing similar concerns simultaneously, it signals alignment rather than coincidence. Then comes the economic dimension, and this is where things start becoming tangible. Economic pressure does not always begin as direct sanctions. Sometimes it starts with friction, trade disruptions, policy disagreements, restrictions that appear temporary but gradually become permanent. These actions serve two purposes. First, they test the resilience of the target. Second, they create a justification loop where each response from the target can be used to validate further escalation. Turkey's recent economic positioning has already introduced elements of this friction. Trade decisions, diplomatic tensions, and policy clashes are no longer isolated events. They are becoming part of a broader pattern. And the important detail here is direction. Once economic interactions begin moving toward restriction rather than cooperation, the path rarely reverses without a major shift. Now here is where the situation becomes more complex, because unlike previous cases, Turkey is not operating from a position of isolation. It has multiple layers of integration, economic, military, and strategic, that make direct pressure significantly more complicated. And this is exactly why the next phase becomes critical: indirect engagement. Indirect engagement means creating environments where confrontation can occur without direct accountability. Historically, this has taken the form of proxy regions, areas where multiple interests overlap, allowing actions to be taken under the cover of broader instability. Syria has already demonstrated this function for multiple actors, and it continues to serve as a space where influence can be tested without triggering immediate large-scale consequences. What makes the current scenario particularly sensitive is the convergence of multiple forces within the same geographical space. When two expanding spheres of influence begin moving toward each other, the probability of friction increases exponentially. And friction, even when accidental, can be used as a trigger point for further escalation. This is the stage where small incidents start carrying disproportionate weight. A single strike, a miscalculation, or an unexpected clash can suddenly become the justification for a much larger response. And the narrative that has already been built ensures that such a response appears justified rather than aggressive. But there is another layer that makes the situation fundamentally different, and this is where most simplified analyses fail. Turkey is not just another regional player, it is embedded within larger alliances that complicate every possible outcome. Any escalation involving Turkey does not remain bilateral, it immediately becomes multilateral by default. And this is where the real tension begins to form. Because when alliances overlap with opposing interests, every decision creates a contradiction. Supporting one side risks alienating another. Staying neutral risks losing credibility with both. And choosing inaction risks allowing the situation to spiral beyond control. This creates what can only be described as a strategic deadlock. Every available path carries significant consequences, and none of them offer a clean resolution. That is the kind of environment where systems begin to strain under their own complexity. Now consider the pace at which events are unfolding. Compared to previous cases, the timeline appears compressed. What once took years is now developing within a much shorter window. And that acceleration is not random. It reflects a world where information spreads faster, reactions happen quicker, and decisions are made under increasing pressure. But acceleration also increases risk. When processes that were originally designed to unfold gradually are forced into a shorter time frame, the margin for error decreases dramatically. And in geopolitics, reduced margins for error often lead to unintended consequences. Here is where things become even more unpredictable. Turkey's strategic posture is not passive. It has demonstrated a consistent willingness to act when it perceives its interests are at stake, and that willingness changes the entire equation. Because a strategy that relies on gradual pressure assumes a certain level of compliance or hesitation from the target. When that assumption does not hold, the strategy itself becomes unstable. This creates a feedback loop where each side's actions reinforce the other's concerns. One move is interpreted as aggression, prompting a response, which is then seen as confirmation of the original threat perception. And once that loop begins, breaking it becomes extremely difficult. The most concerning part is that this process does not require a deliberate decision to escalate into full conflict. It can happen incrementally through a series of smaller actions that individually seem manageable, but collectively lead to a point of no return. And right now we are approaching that threshold. Because when narratives are established, economic friction is in place, indirect engagement zones are active, and alliances are under strain, the system reaches a critical state where even a minor trigger can produce a major outcome. The question is not whether escalation is guaranteed, but whether the current trajectory increases its probability. And all signs suggest that it does. But here is the part that changes everything. Unlike previous situations, the outcome here does not remain confined to a single region or a single relationship. The interconnected nature of the players involved means that any major shift will ripple outward, affecting systems far beyond the immediate conflict zone. This is no longer a contained scenario. It is a structural stress test, and when structures are tested under pressure, they reveal their weaknesses. The real uncertainty is not about who gains or loses in a direct confrontation. It is about how the surrounding systems respond to the strain. Because history has shown that the most significant transformations often occur not when a strategy succeeds, but when it encounters resistance it was not designed to handle. And if that resistance continues to build, the next phase will not look like what anyone expects. Because the pattern is still unfolding and the final step has not yet revealed itself, the moment a pattern begins to accelerate, it stops behaving like a controlled strategy and starts behaving like momentum. And momentum, once it builds, does not wait for permission. It carries everything forward whether the system is ready or not. This is exactly where the situation is heading now. Because what we are seeing is no longer just positioning, it is alignment. Different pieces are moving into place at the same time, across different regions, across different domains. And when that kind of synchronization appears, it signals preparation rather than coincidence. Focus on the shifts that are happening beneath the surface, not the headlines that dominate attention for a day and then disappear. Military positioning, intelligence coordination, diplomatic signaling, these are the indicators that define direction. And right now, those indicators are pointing toward convergence. Not immediate confrontation, but a narrowing gap between two forces that are increasingly aware of each other's intentions. One of the most critical developments in any geopolitical buildup is the quiet transformation of defensive postures into flexible ones. Defensive structures are designed to absorb pressure, but flexible structures are designed to respond. That transition is subtle, and it rarely gets announced publicly, but it changes everything. Because once a system becomes responsive rather than purely defensive, the probability of action increases significantly. Turkey has been moving in that direction for years, but the pace has intensified recently. Its military deployments are no longer static, they are adaptive. Its regional engagements are no longer limited, they are layered. And its diplomatic language is no longer cautious, it is increasingly direct. These are not isolated changes, they are indicators of a state preparing for multiple scenarios simultaneously. At the same time, the opposing side is not slowing down either. Strategic pressure is continuing to build, not through one major move, but through a series of smaller, calculated steps that collectively reshape the environment. This is important because large, dramatic actions attract global attention and immediate responses, while smaller actions often pass with minimal resistance, allowing them to accumulate over time. Now consider what happens when these two dynamics intersect. On one side, you have a structure that relies on continuous pressure to maintain its position. On the other side, you have a state that is increasingly prepared to resist and respond to that pressure. The result is not balance, it is friction. And friction, when sustained, generates heat. That heat does not appear all at once. It builds gradually, often unnoticed, until it reaches a point where even a minor spark can ignite something much larger. This is why analysts who focus only on major events often miss the real story. The real story is in the buildup, in the accumulation of smaller shifts that eventually create a tipping point. Another factor that cannot be ignored is the role of perception. In modern conflicts, perception is not just a reflection of reality, it actively shapes reality. If one side believes that the other is preparing for confrontation, it will adjust its own behavior accordingly, and those adjustments in turn reinforce the original perception. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle where expectations begin to drive actions. Right now, that cycle is already in motion. Both sides are interpreting each other's moves through a lens of suspicion, and that lens is becoming more focused over time. The danger here is that once perception solidifies, reversing it becomes extremely difficult. Even neutral or defensive actions can be interpreted as aggressive if they fit the existing narrative. And this is where the situation becomes particularly volatile, because when perception and reality begin to diverge, decisions are no longer based purely on facts, they are based on interpretations. And interpretations, unlike facts, can escalate rapidly. Now layer onto this the complexity of external actors. Unlike previous scenarios where the conflict remained relatively contained, this situation involves multiple stakeholders with overlapping interests. Each of these actors has its own priorities, its own red lines, and its own thresholds for action. Coordinating all of these variables is not just difficult, it is nearly impossible. This creates an environment where misalignment becomes inevitable. One actor's attempt to de-escalate can be interpreted by another as weakness. One actor's attempt to show strength can be interpreted as provocation. And because communication between all parties is never perfectly synchronized, misunderstandings begin to accumulate. Those misunderstandings are not harmless. Over time, they form the basis for larger miscalculations. And in a high-tension environment, a single miscalculation can trigger a chain reaction that no one fully controls. This is why indirect signals become so important. Statements that might seem minor on their own often carry deeper meaning when viewed in context. Military exercises, changes in deployment patterns, shifts in diplomatic tone, these are all forms of communication. They send messages without explicitly stating them. And right now, those messages are becoming more frequent and more pointed. The signals are no longer vague, they are increasingly specific. This suggests that both sides are not only aware of the situation, but are actively shaping it. But shaping a situation is not the same as controlling it. Control implies predictability, and predictability is exactly what is disappearing. The more variables are introduced, the harder it becomes to anticipate outcomes. And when outcomes become unpredictable, decision-making becomes riskier. This is the stage where strategies often begin to break down. Not because they were flawed at the start, but because they were designed for a different set of conditions. When conditions change faster than strategies can adapt, gaps begin to appear. And those gaps are where unexpected events emerge. One of the most overlooked aspects of this situation is the psychological dimension. Leaders are not operating in a vacuum. They are influenced by domestic pressures, public expectations, and political constraints. These factors can push decision-making in directions that might not align with long-term strategic interests. For example, appearing weak in a high-tension environment can carry significant political costs. This creates an incentive to respond more aggressively than might otherwise be necessary. And when both sides face similar pressures, the likelihood of escalation increases. Now imagine this dynamic playing out in real time. A minor incident occurs, something that under normal circumstances could be resolved quietly, but in the current environment, it becomes amplified. Media coverage intensifies, public reactions grow, and political leaders feel compelled to respond decisively. That response then triggers a counter-response, which is interpreted as further escalation. And just like that, a manageable situation begins to spiral. This is not a hypothetical scenario. It is a pattern that has repeated throughout history in different forms. The difference now is the scale and speed at which it can unfold. Technology plays a significant role here. Information spreads instantly, reactions are immediate, and narratives can shift within hours. This compresses the decision-making timeline, leaving less room for careful consideration. And when decisions are made under time pressure, the risk of error increases. At the same time, military capabilities have evolved. Precision strikes, advanced surveillance, and rapid deployment systems mean that actions can be taken quickly and with significant impact. This increases both the temptation and the risk of taking decisive action. But perhaps the most critical factor is the absence of a clear off-ramp. In previous conflicts, there were often mechanisms in place to de-escalate tensions before they reached a critical point. Diplomatic channels, mutual agreements, or external mediation provided ways to step back. Right now, those mechanisms appear weaker. Trust is limited, communication is strained, and the willingness to compromise is reduced. Without a clear off-ramp, the path forward becomes narrower and more dangerous. And this brings us to the core issue, inevitability versus choice. From the outside, it may appear that events are moving toward a predetermined outcome, but in reality, there are still choices being made at every stage. The problem is that those choices are becoming increasingly constrained. Each decision reduces the number of available options for the next one, and as those options narrow, the system becomes more rigid. Eventually, it reaches a point where the remaining choices all lead in the same general direction. We are not at that point yet, but we are moving closer to it. And the closer we get, the more sensitive the system becomes to disruption. Because when a system is under pressure, even a small disturbance can have a large effect. And right now, the pressure is still building, not releasing. The signals are still aligning, not diverging, and the most critical moves are still happening in the background where most people are not looking. Which means by the time the next major event becomes visible, it may already be too late to reverse it.